The crash out happening all over TikTok that I have seen by the Melungeon community taking DNA tests and not having Native American DNA show up and having African DNA show up is absolutely hilarious to me, and I'm going to tell you why. Many Melungeon people from southern Appalachia have been told their whole lives, and their grandparents have been told their whole lives, that, you descend from a Cherokee princess or you descend from a Native American. That's where your dark features come from. That's why you don't look completely white passing, etc. Now, there are some pretty prominent researchers that have looked into this, and people really pushed back when their findings came out. I can't remember exactly the name of the researcher, but he basically researched a whole bunch of the prominent family lines in southern Appalachia that were Melungeon, one of them being the Collins family and the Goins family, both of which I'm descended from. He ended up finding out that these families had virtually no trace of Native American DNA through genealogy or DNA testing. Instead, they descended from free people of color in the early Virginia colonies, as well as freed enslaved Africans. Now, when this researcher came out with his findings and was like, yeah, you guys aren't Native American, you're Black. That's why you have these traits. That's where your family comes from. There was an incredible amount of pushback and anti-Blackness in the Melungeon communities that was really shown and came to the forefront. What's really interesting is that these people's ancestors were forced to go into hiding, were forced to say and to not claim their African heritage because it was a survival mechanism. Because if they did claim that, the laws of the time would make them and their children at risk for being enslaved. There are court records showing multiple families that are prominent Melungeon families in court trying to basically defend themselves and their right to freedom, because their neighbors and other Appalachian settlers that were completely European were basically after them and didn't want them in the area that they were settled in. I'm not saying that there aren't Romani and there aren't Spanish DNA in some of these Melungeon groups. Like, for instance, I do have Romani DNA in one side of my family. But the most recent ancestry that's going to lead to those characteristics is African DNA.
We're going to have this little conversation because I remember the first time I got called Melungeon, and it was in Washington State, and I had no idea because I was about 20, and I was like, oh, what? And so I had to go down the rabbit hole because this woman was like, we are related. And she's like, but you're, darker. And I had no idea. When I say she's probably the only one who identified with the Black part, I also was in West Virginia in Charleston for a work assignment. And literally, there were people saying, you look Melungeon there as well. And I think about 10 years had passed since someone had said it to me. So I was like, I had to kind of jog my memory about it. And it was one of those situations where you're sitting there like, people will do anything to not identify as just biracial. Because I've been in indigenous communities and they're just like, yeah, she's one of us. It is just like, the thing about it is, I believe we're all a melting pot. And the sooner you accept it, the better. But people will deny the Black heritage side forever. But my thing is, I never minded being dark skinned because the thing about it was, I was the kid that came out that you didn't question if I was Black. And that was safety and security. Many biracial and house slaves didn't make it because they were biracial. They were unalived by the women, a high mortality rate for that. So I made it through, and you didn't know. And that was the greatest thing ever. But that's going to be on part two, the differences between field and house, because clearly you think there's privilege in being lighter, and there was worse for people in the house. That's where what happens in the house stays in the house. So listen for part two from some oral history that I've received over the course of my life.